"Sir, your daughter is in danger of losing her life," said the little beggar to the millionaire. The morning cold clung to the streets of Manhattan like an invisible mist. The hurried steps of executives and office workers resounded in a city that never permitted pauses. In the middle of the crowd, Richard Evans stood out, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, a black overcoat draped over his broad shoulders, and leather gloves that seemed to reject the slightest contact with the roughness of common life. He walked with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he belonged, at the top. Richard was not just another wealthy man lost in the skyscrapers of New York. He was the embodiment of success. Owner of Evans Corporation, one of the most prestigious financial groups on Wall Street, Richard was known for his ruthlessness in business and the coldness with which he treated everything outside the realm of contracts and profits. His personal life, reduced to carefully measured doses, was limited to brief encounters with his daughter Emily, whom he loved but did not quite know how to handle, and formal meetings with his ex-wife Laura, always restricted to what concerned the girl. That morning was supposed to be like any other, routine, predictable, and safe within the rules of the financial market. However, the unexpected emerged just as Richard stepped out of the revolving doors of his office building, located on 5th Avenue. Amidst the bustle of people, an incongruous presence stood out. A small beggar, thin and disheveled, dressed in torn clothes and with a face marked by dirt and cold. The boy's big eyes stared fixedly at Richard. At first, Richard ignored him, attributing the gaze to the usual curiosity of street children for luxury cars and well-dressed people. Without reducing his pace, he advanced towards his black Mercedes parked on the corner, but the boy did not give up. Silent, determined, Eli, for that was his name, walked a few steps to block the millionaire's path. His small body trembled, slightly under the worn jacket that barely protected him from the biting winter. Richard glanced at him without empathy. The child's appearance reminded him of the poverty he had so meticulously avoided in his rise to power. Eli, however, did not lower his gaze. He remained there, motionless, as if waiting for something more than just a few coins or scraps. The driver, noticing the situation, hurriedly approached to remove the boy from Richard's path, but the millionaire raised a hand, signaling for him to wait. There was something in that child's gaze, a mixture of determination and fear that made Richard pause, even if only for a second. Richard's silence was not compassion. It was more the discomfort of having his path interrupted by something he considered an anomaly in his routine. His instincts as a businessman made him analyze Eli as if he were a problem to be solved. Yet something restrained him from simply brushing the boy aside. The air seemed to grow colder, even amid the city's chaos. Horns blared, people hurried, past and still. Richard and Eli remained there in an invisible bubble where the world's noise became distant. The boy did not speak. He just watched Richard with those eyes that, despite the dirt, shone with a strange clarity. Feeling ridiculous, for even hesitating, Richard finally decided to bypass the boy and continue on his way. As he stepped to the side, Eli whispered almost imperceptibly, "Sir, your daughter is in danger." The words were like a cold slap. Richard froze mid-step. He turned sharply to face the boy, whose small figure now seemed even more fragile against the grey concrete. He narrowed his eyes, trying to interpret whether he had heard correctly. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice firm, but not as steady as he would have liked. Eli, without lowering his gaze, repeated in a soft but clear voice, "Your daughter is in danger, sir." There was no plea, no request for help, no mention of money, just a statement that for some reason pierced Richard's armored composure. For a second, Richard felt the world tilt. His mind raced to Emily, to her peaceful mornings playing in the garden of her mother's house, to her innocent laughter. He clenched his fists, rejecting the absurdity of the situation. It had to be a trick, some kind of emotional blackmail, or coincidence. He took a deep breath, trying to restore order to his thoughts. Without saying another word, Richard turned away abruptly, signaling his driver to start the car. The vehicle slid silently through the streets. But inside, Richard could not forget the boy's words. His rational mind dismissed it as nonsense, but another, quieter voice echoed deep within him, asking why he felt so disturbed. Eli remained on the sidewalk, watching the car disappear amidst the morning fog. His small frame, though frail, carried a weight far greater than that of the city that swallowed people every day. He knew that Richard would not believe him so easily. No one ever did at first, yet he also knew that he could not turn his back, not this time. Not when it involved a child. The day went on as usual for New York, but for Richard, the hours dragged on with an unbearable sense of disquiet. During meetings, numbers and contracts blurred in front of his eyes. During lunch, the taste of food was as dull as cardboard. And every time he closed his eyes for even a second, the image of Eli and his words re-emerged, forcing him to confront something that no logic could explain. Richard tried to dismiss it. He repeated to himself that it was impossible. How could a street child know anything about Emily? What game was that? But despite all his attempts to rationalize, the doubt had already been planted. And doubts, Richard knew from experience, were like cracks in the foundation of even the most solid buildings. As night fell and the lights of the city turned the glass windows into mirrors, Richard stared at his reflection. In the silent office, with the city pulsating below, he finally admitted to himself what he feared the most. For the first time in years, something was happening that he could not control. And that something had the voice of a child who should not know anything about his life. Richard had no way of knowing then, but that morning encounter had just begun a chain of events that would dismantle everything he thought he knew about himself, his past, and above all, about the true meaning of being a father. Richard awoke the next morning trying to convince himself that the strange episode with the boy was just another random encounter, one of those uncomfortable moments that big cities throw at their inhabitants. Still, as he adjusted his tie in front of the mirror and rehearsed the day ahead, Eli's words echoed persistently. "Your daughter is in danger." They had penetrated his rational defenses with surgical precision. The more he tried to forget them, the more they seemed to anchor themselves in the most hidden corners of his mind. Despite the inner turmoil, Richard maintained his usual routine. He went to work, buried himself in meetings, and closed multi-million-dollar deals with his typical cold efficiency. However, during each interval between negotiations, in every brief silence when the world outside his office slowed for a fraction of a second, he remembered Eli's eyes, not pleading but resolute, as if the child truly knew something vital. It wasn't until the end of the day that Richard had to confront the gravity of those words. When he arrived to pick up Emily, as he did twice, a week according to the divorce agreement, he found her quieter than usual. Normally, the girl would run to him with a smile, asking for stories about the skyscrapers or news of the city. That day, however, she seemed tired, her little body leaning against Laura's hand, who also appeared concerned. On the way back to Richard's apartment, Emily remained strangely silent, watching the lights of the city without excitement. Richard attempted awkwardly to start a conversation, telling her about the new building his company was financing. Emily nodded, giving weak smiles but without the usual enthusiasm. The apartment, luxurious and impersonal as always, seemed even colder with Emily's withdrawn presence. Richard observed her eat dinner without appetite, noticing how she left most of the food untouched, something she rarely did. After putting her to bed, he found himself pacing through the spacious but empty rooms, the silence around him as heavy as Eli's words. The following morning brought no relief. Emily woke up dizzy, needing help to stand. Richard, alarmed, considered taking her immediately to the hospital, but Emily insisted she was just tired. Richard attributed it to a mild flu and decided to monitor her throughout the day. However, things worsened when Laura called him at the office, her voice trembling. Emily had fainted at school. The teachers, scared, had already called an ambulance. Richard rushed to the hospital, where he found Laura at Emily's bedside, who, though conscious, appeared extremely weak. The doctors, after a series of tests, could not identify any clear cause. They talked about possible anemia, infections, and even stress. Richard listened to them, trying to find a rational explanation, but deep down, the words of the little beggar pierced through all the medical jargon. Your daughter is in danger, he remembered. Laura noticed Richard's discomfort and questioned him during one of the brief moments they had alone. Is there something you're not telling me? She asked, visibly worried. Richard hesitated but ended up dismissing it. How could he tell her about the strange encounter without sounding completely absurd? He preferred silence to the risk of seeming desperate or irrational. Despite the negative test results, Emily's condition did not improve in the following days. She remained pale with difficulty walking and suffered new fainting spells. Richard began to feel a deep frustration. Used to solving problems with money and connections, he was now facing something he could not control. His wealth could buy the best doctors, the best equipment, but none of them could offer a diagnosis, and that to him was unacceptable. Eli's words began to weigh heavier with each passing hour. Richard found himself reanalyzing every moment of the encounter, trying to decipher if there had been any indication that the boy could know something real. Was it mere coincidence? Or could the child have information that no one else did? On a Thursday evening, after another day of unsuccessful consultations and specialists who left him with more questions than answers, Richard saw Eli again. The boy stood exactly where he had been the first time, near the revolving doors of Richard's building. This time Richard didn't hesitate. He approached Eli determinedly, intending to demand an explanation. However, before he could even open his mouth, the boy spoke again. "Your daughter is running out of time," Eli said, looking directly into his eyes. His voice, though soft, carried a weight that unsettled Richard more than he cared to admit. "What do you know? How do you know my daughter?" Richard's voice came out harsher than he intended, drawing the attention of a few passers-by. Eli did not flinch. He remained calm, staring straight into Richard's soul. "I can help," Eli replied, "but you need to listen to me." Richard clenched his fists, feeling a mixture of anger, fear, and confusion. The rational part of him screamed that this was all manipulation, perhaps even extortion. But another part, one he preferred to keep buried, whispered that maybe he needed to listen. The next day, Emily's condition worsened. She could barely get out of bed, her tiny body fragile like never before. Laura was desperate, and even Richard, who always kept himself collected, felt an unfamiliar panic creeping in. He looked at Emily as if seeing her for the first time, not just as the daughter he visited periodically, but as the most precious and vulnerable person in his life. Alone in his office that night, staring at the skyline of a city that symbolized power and control, Richard realized that control was exactly what he lacked. For the first time, he admitted to himself that maybe he should listen to the little beggar. As he poured himself a glass of scotch to calm his nerves, the city lights blurred behind the glass. His mind returned again and again to Eli's eyes, to the certainty in his voice, and to the fact that Emily was getting worse regardless of what the doctors said. And in that solitude, Richard made a decision. He would find Eli again. And this time he would listen, no matter how absurd it sounded. The following week unfolded under a thick atmosphere of apprehension. Every small detail of Emily's behavior became magnified in Richard's eyes. His apartment, previously a cold and silent sanctuary of productivity, was now filled with silent concerns, and the empty spaces seemed to echo with the sound of her weak footsteps. Richard noticed Emily struggling to maintain balance when walking, often leaning against the walls or pieces of furniture, as if gravity itself had turned hostile. At first, he tried to attribute it to simple tiredness, to the stress of school, or even to some viral infection common in children. Laura, however, wasn't convinced. During one of her daily visits, while Emily rested on the couch, she confronted Richard directly. "This isn't normal, you see it, don't you?" she asked, arms crossed and eyes sharp. Richard nodded reluctantly. He saw it, but admitting it meant accepting that there was something far beyond his control unfolding before them. Over the next few days, Emily's condition became impossible to ignore. She began to suffer episodes of dizziness that forced her to sit suddenly on the floor wherever she was. Once, while they were walking in Central Park, she suddenly collapsed. Without warning, Richard, horrified, carried her in his arms to the car and drove straight to the hospital. Once again, tests were inconclusive. The doctors, baffled, insisted that it could be a rare neurological condition, but nothing concrete explained the fainting, the weakness, or the recurring disorientation. The words from Eli, the little beggar, kept resonating even stronger in Richard's thoughts. Every symptom, every new scare seemed to validate what the boy had tried to warn him about, yet his logical side still resisted. He couldn't or wouldn't believe that such information could come from a child on the streets. The rational part of him insisted that the best specialists in New York could resolve this, that science would give him an answer. But as each day passed without a diagnosis, Richard began to feel the walls closing in. Laura was the first to bring up the possibility of something external. What if it's something environmental, something she's exposed to? Richard dismissed it initially, unwilling to face the idea that the problem might not be biological, but something even more terrifying and unknown. Yet deep down, he knew Laura was right to at least consider other angles. He, however, couldn't get rid of the image of Eli standing under the cold New York wind, saying those words without hesitation. Emily's school reported increasing concerns. Teachers noticed that she was unfocused, sleepy, and more clumsy than usual. In one instance, she almost fell from a staircase, narrowly saved by a classmate. The teachers, concerned, recommended suspending her school activities until her health stabilized. For Richard, this felt like a blow. Emily, always so lively and curious, now seemed trapped in a lethargy from which no one could wake her. At night, Richard sat by Emily's bedside, watching her sleep uneasily, sometimes moaning in discomfort. Laura often stayed over, unable to leave their daughter in that condition. The dynamic between Richard and Laura remained tense, but was inevitably softened by the shared fear. They exchanged glances full of silent questions and unspoken fears. Richard's relationship with Emily also took on a new, fragile intimacy. Used to spending limited weekends and holidays with his daughter, he now realized how little he truly knew about her daily life. Each gesture, each sigh seemed like an unknown world he had never ventured into. As he gently held her small hand, he could feel the pulse weaker than it should be, and this detail haunted him more than any market crash or financial loss ever had. It was during one of these nights, in the solitude of the apartment lit only by the faint city lights, that Richard finally voiced what had been tormenting him. To Laura, who sat exhausted in the armchair beside the bed, he whispered, "There's something someone told me. I didn't give it much credit at first." Laura, tired but attentive, raised her eyes. "What is it, Richard?" she asked, her voice both firm and soft. "There was a boy, a street kid. He told me Emily was in danger," Richard confessed, feeling as if the mere act of saying it out loud made the situation even more surreal. Laura frowned, skeptical. "A beggar? What kind of danger?" "I don't know," Richard admitted. "He didn't explain, he just said she was in danger." Silence settled between them, heavy and oppressive. Laura tried to process the information without letting herself be carried away by irrational fear. Yet the situation was so desperate that even the most unlikely clues seemed worth considering. Richard spent the following days visibly divided between his meetings at the office, where his partners began to notice his unusual distraction and the constant worry about Emily. Nothing made sense. No diagnosis, no medical theory, nothing that could justify the progressive deterioration of his daughter. He began to suspect that maybe it wasn't about an illness at all. Perhaps, against all logic, the danger wasn't something physical, but external. An influence, a contamination, or even an invisible threat that could be affecting Emily without anyone realizing. The more he thought about it, the more the rational walls he had built throughout his life began to crack. Meanwhile, Emily became increasingly fragile. She now barely got out of bed. Her eyes, once full of curiosity and brightness, had become dull. The few words she spoke were often interrupted by shortness of breath, and her small hands trembled as she tried to hold her father's or Laura's fingers. Richard watched helplessly, feeling more impotent than he had ever felt. It wasn't just about Emily's health anymore. It was about the urgency he sensed growing with every passing minute. Richard realized he could no longer afford to ignore Eli's warning. Whether it was a scam, coincidence, or pure desperation, he needed to find the boy again. not because he believed fully in what Eli had said, but because for the first time, Richard felt that ignoring him could cost him the most important thing he had. On the streets of Manhattan, beneath the indifferent lights and the endless rush of people, Eli was still out there, waiting. The next morning, Richard walked through the marble corridors of the Evans Corporation headquarters with the same determined steps as always, yet the mask of control he usually wore no longer fit his face so perfectly. The elegant employees who greeted him noticed the subtle change, a tension in his eyes, a distracted nod here and there. He tried, as he had always done, to bury personal matters under the weight of professional obligations, believing that time and resources could solve anything, as they always had. But even he could not deny that Emily's condition was no longer just a medical case. It was a terrifying mystery. Despite the sleepless nights, Richard still refused to fully connect the dots between Eli's enigmatic warning and Emily's health. He forced himself to believe that the child was just an opportunist who had guessed at a rich man's vulnerability. Richard had seen thousands of such people in his life, men, women, and even children trying to take advantage of weakness, often inventing stories in exchange for money or favor. Why should Eli be any different? Richard pushed the thought aside and focused on organizing another round of consultations with top pediatric neurologists. Specialists from Boston, Chicago, and even London were contacted. Money, after all, was not an obstacle. Richard was convinced that if he could gather the right experts, someone would eventually give him an answer. Laura, however, was no longer so confident. The motherly instinct she always trusted whispered that this situation could not be solved by money alone. Laura had always been less attached to the comforts of wealth than Richard, and she knew that sometimes answers did not come from prestigious diplomas or famous clinics. While Richard remained anchored in denial, Emily continued to deteriorate. The little girl who once loved drawing and reading stories now spent her days staring silently at the ceiling, as if waiting for a storm no one else could see. Her faint voice often called out for her father, but when Richard appeared, the girl only gave him a tired smile, as if too exhausted to speak further. The scene repeated itself daily, corroding the businessman's self-assurance. One night, unable to sleep, Richard stood in front of the large window of his apartment, watching the pulse of New York below. His reflection on the glass showed a man he barely recognized. He saw in himself the same fear that he had seen in Laura's eyes the day before, and even more unsettling in Eli's eyes when they met again on the street days ago. Eli had not looked like a common street child playing with pity. His expression carried an urgency that no money could fake. Yet Richard's pride remained intact. Admitting that a street boy could know something the city's best minds did not was too much for him. He needed to believe he could solve this with logic, science, and the unshakable power of influence that had always served him. Richard was a man who made governments kneel during financial crises. Why would a boy in rags hold an answer he did not? However, the cracks were showing. Richard avoided Laura's gaze during hospital visits, where Emily remained hospitalized. Under close observation, Laura had begun to confront him more directly, demanding he share more about the supposed conversation with Eli. She insisted that anything, no matter how absurd, should be considered. Richard, in response, only offered evasive answers, suggesting that the boy was just a distraction. But inside, Richard was starting to feel the crushing weight of helplessness. Each time Emily's small hand squeezed his weakly, he realized that his empire, his millions, and his prestigious name meant nothing when it came to saving the person he loved most. The great Richard Evans, admired and feared by CEOs, politicians, and judges, could not keep his daughter from wasting away before his eyes. And yet, he clung to denial, clung to the belief that some medical report would arrive any minute with a miraculous explanation. He focused obsessively on scheduling exams, seeking alternative therapies, and even accepting experimental studies suggested by desperate doctors. He flooded Emily's hospital room with the latest technology, the most modern monitors, and the most qualified nurses trying to create a fortress against the inevitable. Meanwhile, Laura, increasingly desperate, found herself searching for information on her own. She revisited parks, schools, and places Emily frequented, looking for anything unusual, something the doctors might have overlooked. It was during one of these lonely walks, leafing through old family albums, that Laura discovered a photograph that stopped her breath. In the faded image, taken during one of Richard's few childhood trips upstate, appeared a boy of about 8 years old, standing next to young Richard and their parents. The child, smiling shyly, bore an uncanny resemblance to Eli. Same sharp eyes, same subtle chin, same disheveled hair. Laura immediately recognized the boy. She had heard Richard mention a younger brother once, only to say he had disappeared, a memory shrouded in pain and silence. She remembered dismissing it at the time, assuming it was an old family tragedy Richard never wanted to revisit. Laura stormed into Richard's office the next morning with the photograph in hand. "Richard, look at this," she said, placing the photo in front of him. Richard, tired and visibly aged by the sleepless nights, took a long time to focus. When he finally did, he stiffened. His eyes narrowed as he stared at the face of the boy, who could very well be Eli. "That's Samuel," he whispered. The name alone seemed like a forbidden word, something Richard had locked away long ago. "You never told me he looked like—" "Eli," Laura accused. "Is it possible that this boy is related to you? That he's not just some random child?" Richard's throat went dry. The resemblance was undeniable. He had buried the memory of Samuel so deep that he had convinced himself it belonged to a past that no longer mattered. But the idea that Eli could somehow be connected to that wound, an old scar he never wanted to touch, shattered his already fragile resistance. He tried to dismiss it. "Coincidences happen," he muttered. "Street kids sometimes resemble people." But even he did not believe that anymore. His voice trembled, slightly betraying the growing storm inside. Could Eli really be more than just a messenger? Could he carry a truth that Richard had refused to confront since childhood? The resemblance, combined with Eli's mysterious warning, became an unbearable weight. Later that night, while sitting alone in the hospital beside Emily, Richard studied her delicate features and pale skin. The monitors beeping softly only intensified the silence in his soul. Richard realized with terrifying clarity that if he did not act soon, if he kept resisting, Emily might not have many days left. He could not afford to ignore the signs any longer. Still, his pride and fear kept him paralyzed. And while outside the hospital, amid the snow-covered streets, Eli waited. The following morning, as Richard sat in his office, attempting to focus on his endless stack of reports and financial forecasts, he could no longer feign indifference. His mind was no longer capable of calculating risks or predicting market fluctuations with the sharpness he was known for. Laura's discovery had shattered something inside him, and although he wanted to label it as an absurd coincidence, the photo remained on his desk, staring at him like an accusation. It was undeniable. Eli resembled Samuel in a way that no random street child could. Haunted by memories he thought had been long buried, Richard drifted into a mental fog, recalling the last time he had seen Samuel. They had been children, running through the woods behind their family's summer house. Samuel, always the more adventurous one, had disappeared without leaving a trace, turning the Evans household into a cold monument of silence and grief. Richard had grown up under the weight of that absence, never speaking about it, learning early on that weakness was neither acceptable nor forgivable. His parents never discussed it openly, and over time, Richard had learned to behave as if Samuel had never existed. But Eli's face, his voice, and that mysterious knowledge about Emily ignited a terrifying possibility. What if Samuel's disappearance was somehow linked to what was happening now? The notion was absurd, and yet it clung to Richard like a shadow. Unable to ignore the doubt any longer, Richard left the office abruptly, ignoring the confused looks from his employees. He returned to Laura's apartment, where she was meticulously reviewing old photo albums and documents. Spread across the living room were papers, newspaper clippings about missing children, and more family photos. It was as if Laura had become an investigator overnight. "You remember him, don't you?" Laura asked as soon as Richard entered. "You can't deny it." "I remember," Richard admitted, his voice barely audible. "But what are you suggesting, that this boy is Samuel? That he survived all these years and somehow knows about Emily? Laura didn't answer directly. She pointed to the documents spread out on the table. Among them were records of Samuel's disappearance, police reports, and even some old letters written by Richard's mother, expressing her despair to friends. None of it contained definitive answers. There was no evidence that Samuel had been found or that he had died. Only his absence remained. The fact is, Laura continued, if Eli is connected to Samuel, if he is somehow family, then we can't ignore him anymore. Richard remained silent. He felt suffocated by a blend of guilt and helplessness. He realized that in his attempt to suppress pain, he had also buried truths that perhaps could have changed everything. That night, Richard walked through the streets of Manhattan, searching for Eli. He returned to the same street corner, near the building where they had first met. Hours passed, and the cold pierced through his coat, but he refused to leave. He no longer cared about appearances or the risk of seeming desperate. For the first time in years, Richard was stripped of his pride. Finally, when the night was deep, and the city had quieted, Eli emerged from an alley carrying a small backpack on his shoulder. His eyes, as always, carried an indescribable gravity. "You're late," Eli said softly, as if he had expected Richard to come. Richard approached cautiously. "I need to know what you meant. About my daughter. About you." Eli looked around, wary of the few wandering figures that still roamed the city at that hour. Then he signaled for Richard to follow him. Without questioning, Richard obeyed, crossing alleys and streets, leaving behind the polished facades of Manhattan for increasingly narrow and darker paths. They finally arrived at an old abandoned tenement whose windows were boarded up and whose walls were marked by years of neglect. Eli entered through a hidden gap between two metal plates, and Richard followed. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy, with the smell of mold and dust, and the dim light of a single lantern barely illuminated the interior. In that decrepit place, Richard saw other children. Some were asleep on makeshift mattresses, others, visibly sick, watched him with suspicion. Richard felt a lump in his throat. He had seen homeless people before, but he had never been confronted so directly with the harsh reality of these children's lives. "These kids, what's happening to them?" Richard asked, horrified. Eli looked at him with the same calm, almost resigned expression. "They're like your daughter," he said. "They've been getting sick for weeks now." Richard observed the children, noticing similar symptoms to those Emily displayed. Pale faces, signs of weakness, some even showing the same difficulty standing or walking. "How do you know all this?" Richard demanded. "Who are you really?" Eli hesitated for a moment, as if weighing how much to reveal. "I know because I've seen it before," he finally said, "and I know where it's coming from." Richard's heart raced. The absurdity of the situation was undeniable, but so was the reality before his eyes. The abandoned building, the sick children, the undeniable parallels with Emily's condition. Everything Eli said fit, even if Richard couldn't yet comprehend how. "Tell me," Richard pressed. "Tell me what you know." But Eli stepped back. "Not yet," he said. "It's bigger than you think. And if you really want to help your daughter, you'll have to help them too." Richard stared at the boy, realizing he was at a crossroads. All the wealth and power he had accumulated meant nothing here. Eli had information he desperately needed, but he would not give it without conditions. That night, as Richard left the abandoned building, the image of the sick children and Eli's calm yet piercing voice followed him. The realization was unavoidable. This wasn't just about Emily anymore. There was something much larger at stake. And Richard, for the first time, understood that he would have to make choices he never imagined, venturing into territories where money, power, and logic were worthless. Richard left the abandoned building with his heart racing and a weight in his chest that refused to lift. The streets of New York, normally so familiar and controllable to him, now seemed like a maze of questions without answers. He felt vulnerable, exposed, as if the very foundations of his meticulously constructed life were crumbling beneath his feet. The image of those children, frail and visibly ill, haunted him with every step. He could no longer see them as mere casualties of poverty. They were a reflection of what was happening to Emily, and deep inside Richard knew he could not ignore them any longer. Upon returning to the hospital, he found Laura sitting at Emily's bedside, holding the girl's weakened hand. Richard remained silent for a few moments, watching them through the glass of the room, trying to gather the courage to share what he had seen. When he finally entered, Laura immediately sensed that something had changed. He wasn't just tired. There was fear in his eyes, the kind that came only when someone realized they were facing something much bigger than they could handle. "We need to talk," he said quietly. Laura listened as Richard told her everything, from the strange encounter with Eli to the discovery of the other sick children hidden in the depths of the city. Every detail sounded surreal, but given the desperate situation they were facing, it was impossible for her to dismiss. "And you believe this boy?" she asked, her voice trembling between skepticism and hope. "I don't know what to believe," Richard admitted. "But I saw those kids, Laura. They are like Emily. They are sick, and Eli knows something. He's hiding something, but he's also trying to help." The next day, together with Laura, Richard returned to the abandoned building. However, upon arriving, they found only emptiness. The place seemed deserted, as if the children had vanished into thin air. Richard walked through the corridors calling for Eli, but the only response was the echo of his own voice. The makeshift beds, the little personal belongings, and even the traces of the children's presence had been removed. Back in his apartment, frustration consumed him. Richard spent hours reviewing security camera footage from the neighborhood near the building, hoping to find a clue about where Eli might have gone. Laura insisted they needed professional help, perhaps even the police, but Richard knew that involving the authorities would only scare Eli and the other children away even more. Days passed, and Emily's condition worsened. The doctors now openly admitted they had no explanation. The treatments weren't working. The examinations showed no concrete diagnosis, and every attempt to stabilize her seemed futile. Richard stood beside her bed at night, watching the rise and fall of her shallow breaths, feeling completely powerless. It was during one of these sleepless nights that Eli reappeared. The boy stood silently at the end of the hospital corridor, watching Richard through the glass. Without a second thought, Richard left Emily's room and approached him. "Where did you go? Why did you disappear?" he asked, controlling the urge to grab the child by the shoulders and demand answers. Eli, calm as always, replied, "I had to be sure you were ready, that you would really listen." "I'm ready," Richard said firmly. "Just tell me what you know." Eli's eyes softened for the first time. "It's not just your daughter, sir. It's many children. And it's not a disease. It's something they are exposed to, something poisoning them." Richard felt his stomach drop. Eli explained that all the children who were sick, including Emily, had frequented the same public spaces, especially a recently reopened park near Central Park. Richard struggled to connect the dots. "A park?" he asked. "What does that have to do with it?" "The water," Eli said, lowering his head. "The water is making them sick." Richard immediately recalled that Emily had spent the last few weekends in that park with Laura, playing near the newly restored fountains and ponds. The doctors had never considered environmental contamination, trusting instead in conventional diagnostics. Richard's heart pounded with the realization that perhaps the answer had been in plain sight all along. "But why hasn't anyone noticed?" Richard asked. "Because no one listens to us," Eli replied bitterly. "Because no one looks for answers where poor children get sick. Because people like you don't want to see." The words hit Richard with brutal force. He realized that, in his obsession with controlling everything through power and wealth, he had overlooked the human element. He had ignored Eli simply because he came from the streets. He had dismissed the possibility because it didn't fit into his rational, privileged world. Determined, Richard brought Laura into the conversation, and the three began investigating together. They visited the park, discreetly collecting water samples and taking note of every corner where children tended to gather. Eli led them to specific points, fountains and drinking fountains, where he had seen the children playing and later falling ill. At the same time, Richard hired independent specialists, without mentioning Emily's situation, to analyze the water discreetly. He didn't trust the city's official reports, suspecting that they could be compromised or manipulated. Laura, on her end, reached out to other parents from Emily's school and neighborhood, discovering, to her horror, that several other children had shown similar symptoms but had not yet connected the dots. Little by little, the puzzle took shape. What was initially seen as isolated health issues now revealed itself as a pattern. Dozens of children from different areas of the city were getting sick after visiting the same park. Richard's investigation reached an alarming preliminary conclusion. The contamination could be the result of poor quality materials or chemicals used during the recent renovations. But the most chilling part was yet to come. Eli, who had remained silent about many things, finally confessed that he had seen trucks late at night dumping substances into the park's underground maintenance areas during the construction period. The workers acted as if they were discarding waste they couldn't leave at official dumping sites. "Why didn't you tell this to anyone before?" Laura asked. "No one listens to kids like me," Eli said simply. Richard, furious and desperate, now knew that the situation went far beyond negligence. It was criminal. Something or someone was responsible for poisoning the city's children, and Emily was running out of time. That night, sitting beside his daughter, who now barely opened her eyes, Richard vowed silently that he would not rest until he exposed the truth, regardless of who he had to confront. And this time, he would listen. The hospital room had turned into a stage of silent despair. The soft beeping of the monitors that tracked Emily's vitals offered no comfort. Instead, it only highlighted the fragility of her condition. Richard spent entire nights seated at her bedside, holding her hand, afraid that if he dared to blink or step away, he might lose her forever. Emily's skin had become increasingly pale, her lips taking on a bluish tint, and her once bright eyes now seemed almost empty, only opening occasionally to glimpse the world with tiredness and confusion. Richard no longer returned to his office. The board of directors managed the company without him, and the markets could collapse for all he cared. Nothing mattered beyond that small hospital bed where his daughter lay fighting an invisible threat. The luxury of power, influence, and wealth, which for so long had defined him, now felt like a cruel joke. Not even the most prestigious hospitals in New York could give him answers. All the specialists agreed on one horrifying fact: Emily was deteriorating, and they had no clear diagnosis. Laura remained strong, but Richard could see the desperation in her eyes every time she believed no one was watching. The exhaustion of the past weeks marked both of them deeply. Still, neither spoke openly about their worst fear, that Emily might not survive much longer. The list of children affected by the mysterious symptoms kept growing. Laura, together with other parents and Eli's help, identified more families facing the same nightmare. Some children were admitted to other hospitals. The others suffered in silence without even medical assistance, lost among the forgotten neighborhoods of the city. The pattern was undeniable, and yet no one seemed willing to confront it. The authorities avoided definitive answers, hiding behind vague statements about isolated cases. Faced with institutional inertia, Richard took matters into his own hands. He discreetly hired private investigators and scientists to analyze not only the park's water, but also the construction contracts, the companies involved, and the supply chains responsible for the renovation. What he found was more disturbing than he had imagined. A small construction company, hired through a suspicious bidding process, had indeed used prohibited materials and improperly disposed of chemical waste. The problem was that this company belonged to a larger conglomerate linked to influential politicians and businessmen, names Richard knew well, some of them even personal acquaintances. The magnitude of the discovery hit him like a storm. He realized that Emily and the other children were victims of corruption that ran through the veins of the very city he had helped build and profit from. What haunted Richard even more was the realization that indirectly he had probably done business with these same people without ever questioning their methods. As he tried to process the horror of it all, Emily had the most serious crisis yet. In the early hours of a freezing dawn, she suffered a convulsive seizure so intense that even the experienced medical team struggled to stabilize her. Richard and Laura were forced to watch helplessly as their daughter fought desperately for each breath, her small body trembling uncontrollably. The room became chaotic, with nurses and doctors moving frantically, injecting medications, adjusting machines, and shouting orders that Richard could barely comprehend. It was only after what felt like an eternity that Emily stabilized, falling into a state of deep unconsciousness. The doctors explained that her condition was now critical. She might not resist another crisis like that. Laura collapsed into tears, while Richard stood frozen, numb, a single tear escaping his eyes as he watched the machines doing the work that his daughter could no longer do alone. At that moment, Richard realized he could no longer afford to wait. There was no more room for doubt or hesitation. Eli's words were not just the warnings of a desperate boy, they were the truth, and Richard had wasted precious time denying it. Guilt consumed him. He remembered every second he had dismissed Eli, every time he had chosen to trust his pride instead of listening. Shortly after the crisis, Richard found Eli again. The boy was waiting outside the hospital, as if he had known what would happen. Without exchanging words, Richard approached him and knelt, something unthinkable for a man who never bowed to anyone. "Help me," Richard pleaded, abandoning all arrogance. Eli looked at him with understanding. "I've been trying," he said softly. Richard, trembling, promised to do whatever it took. He would not only help Eli, but also expose those responsible, no matter who they were. The boy nodded and, without delay, led Richard to an even darker part of the city. They entered old underground maintenance tunnels that connected parts of Manhattan's infrastructure. Hidden in these forgotten corridors were dozens of other children, some so ill they could barely lift their heads. Richard, shocked, realized the magnitude of the tragedy. It wasn't just about a handful of kids, there were too many. Boys and girls who had found refuge in the shadows, abandoned by the system, and now condemned by the poisons spreading through the water. "The city doesn't see us," Eli said, guiding Richard through the corridors. "No one sees these children, and now when they need help, they're still invisible." Richard clenched his jaw, absorbing the bitter truth. He knew the city was harsh and indifferent, but he had never realized the scale of abandonment. He had contributed to this blindness. His fortune had been built on a system that allowed horrors like these to flourish, hidden from the public eye. Back at the hospital, Laura barely recognized the man who returned that night. Richard was visibly transformed. His eyes no longer carried just the desperation of a father, but the determination of someone who had finally understood that this fight was bigger than him. He explained everything to Laura, the contamination, the connection between the construction company and the authorities, the abandoned children. Laura listened in disbelief, but knew Richard was telling the truth. For the first time in years, she saw in him something she thought had been lost long ago: humanity. Richard was no longer the ruthless businessman, incapable of looking beyond numbers. He was a father on the verge of losing his daughter, and a man who could no longer turn his back on what was right. With no more time to lose, Richard made a decision. He would go public, risk everything, and reveal what he had discovered. Even if it meant ruining his career, challenging powerful people, or being humiliated. None of it mattered anymore. Only Emily and those other children mattered, and now there was no going back. Richard barely slept after making his decision. He knew that the next steps could dismantle everything he had built: his reputation, his company, and even his social standing would be shattered once he went public with the information he now held. But none of that mattered anymore. His daughter's fading pulse and the fragile bodies of those street children haunted every second of his thoughts. For the first time in decades, he was prepared to sacrifice everything without hesitation. The next morning, with the first light of day piercing through the icy fog of Manhattan, Richard returned to Eli, who was waiting silently at the entrance of one of the hidden tunnels. Without exchanging words, they crossed the maze of underground passages until they reached what Eli called the shelter. The place wasn't just an abandoned tenement or an improvised hideout. It was a forgotten structure from the old subway system, an incomplete station abandoned decades ago and repurposed by the children into a shelter against the brutal streets above. Richard's heart sank when he entered. The cold, humid air was thick with the smell of mold and rust. Dozens of children, ranging from toddlers to teenagers, occupied the old platform. They slept on cardboard, old mattresses, and in some cases, directly on the concrete floor. Some tried to warm themselves with scraps of fabric and newspapers. Most were visibly sick, presenting the same symptoms as Emily: weakness, pale skin, slow reflexes, and an apparent deterioration of physical strength. The sight was unbearable. Richard had seen poverty before, but not like this. He had invested billions in the city, financed luxury projects, skyscrapers and shopping centers, and yet never realized that just beneath the surface, entire lives were crumbling in places like this. These children were literally beneath New York, ignored and invisible. "How long have you been here?" Richard asked Eli, barely able to speak without his voice breaking. "A long time," Eli answered without emotion. "Some of us were born here. Others found the shelter after the symptoms started. We don't have anywhere else." Richard examined every corner, noting with horror the makeshift infirmary, assembled with found objects, where two older girls tried to take care of the youngest. He saw children with trembling hands, eyes darkened by fatigue, and some barely able to sit up. They were fighting for their lives, isolated, without anyone above knowing or caring. "These kids all went to the park," Eli explained. "Just like Emily. We used to play there too. It was the only safe place we had during the day. But after they finished fixing it, after the construction was done, we started getting sick." Richard clenched his fists. He now fully understood. The newly remodeled park, marketed as a modernized haven for families, had become a death trap. And the truth was no accident. Eli had seen the workers dumping something into the underground pipes. Chemicals, construction waste, or perhaps illegal toxic materials that now contaminated the water used by fountains and drinking stations. The more Richard analyzed the situation, the more certain he became that it was deliberate negligence covered up by powerful people. He spent the following hours listening to the children, documenting everything. He took photos, recorded testimonies, and gathered details that could not be ignored. Laura, upon receiving the first images and information, was overwhelmed with emotion. She knew the city could be indifferent, but never imagined that the neglect would reach this level of cruelty. "Richard, we have to do something now," she said through the phone. Richard, though consumed by guilt, felt a spark of determination. He knew the extent of the corruption he was about to face. The construction company involved had ties to politicians, influential businessmen, and members of the city council. Going public would mean triggering a war against the most powerful people in New York, but none of that terrified him, as much as the idea of losing Emily or allowing other children to die without anyone even knowing why. That night, Richard returned to the hospital with more resolve than ever. Laura met him with news that shattered him even further. Emily was no longer responding to verbal stimuli. The doctors feared she was entering a coma. Richard collapsed into the chair next to her bed, holding her hand tightly. His world, already fragile, now seemed on the brink of total collapse. Eli visited secretly, sneaking through the emergency exit. His presence in the room was met without question. Richard and Laura no longer saw him as just a street child. He was the only one who had truly warned them, the only one who seemed to know how deep this went. "You have to act fast," Eli said, looking directly at Richard. "It's spreading, and soon it will be too late." Richard realized then that waiting another day was not an option. He couldn't rely on legal procedures or discreet reports. The city wouldn't act without public outrage, without pressure so intense that even the most influential couldn't hide. He needed to expose everything, openly, urgently. At dawn, Richard prepared everything. He gathered evidence, testimonies, images of the abandoned shelter, medical reports of the children, and even secret documents obtained by his investigators. He contacted trusted journalists who owed him favors from past years when he manipulated the media for corporate interests. But now he would use those same channels to reveal a far more important truth. In parallel, he asked Laura to mobilize parents who had children affected, encouraging them to speak out and support the cause. Fear was the strongest barrier, But the desperation was greater. They no longer cared about threats or retaliation. They only wanted their children to survive. While New York continued its cold, indifferent mornings, Richard worked silently but frantically, preparing for the storm he was about to unleash. He knew that as soon as the first word was published, there would be no turning back. He would be considered a traitor by the elites. He would face lawsuits, accusations, and attempts to discredit him. But for the first time, Richard did not care. Emily's fragile breathing and Eli's warning were the only truths that mattered. That same night, before releasing the information, Richard returned one last time to the shelter. The children were there staring at him silently, as if sensing that something was about to change. Richard promised to them and to himself that he would not fail. And when he left, walking through the dark tunnels back to the surface, Richard knew he was no longer the man who, years ago, learned to bury feelings to climb the ladder of success. He was now a father prepared to challenge everything for the life of his daughter and for children who had never even been given a chance to be heard. By the next morning, Richard no longer carried the composed posture of the powerful executive that everyone in Manhattan had grown accustomed to. He arrived at the hospital early, where Laura waited with a group of anxious parents who had learned of the growing number of sick children. They had seen the evidence Richard collected, the photos of the shelter, the contaminated water tests, and the testimonies of the abandoned children. What they held in their hands was far more than suspicion. It was the undeniable outline of a conspiracy. Richard, however, needed certainty before confronting the city and the powerful names behind the disaster. He, Laura, and Eli began a meticulous investigation into every detail. Eli guided them through streets, abandoned lots, and areas around the renovated park that had been neglected by the public. It was during this tense expedition that they found the key, hidden beneath an old maintenance hatch behind the park's main playground. In the underground passage, partially flooded and corroded by time, they discovered barrels labeled with faded, illegible codes, some with hazard symbols, partially submerged in stagnant water. The barrels were leaking. The odor was overwhelming, sharp and metallic, burning their noses and throats. Eli, covering his face with a scarf, pointed to the pipes that connected directly to the park's fountains. "This is where it started," he murmured. Richard's hands trembled as he recorded everything with his phone. The location was obscure, enough that only someone who had worked on the renovations could know about it. The park had been the perfect dumping ground, untraceable, hidden beneath layers of concrete and maintenance structures that no ordinary citizen would access. The toxins, slowly seeping into the water, were poisoning the fountains, which the children, innocently playing during the hot afternoons, drank from without any suspicion. Returning to the hospital, Richard and Laura cross-referenced city records and noticed that the construction company responsible for the park's restoration had a history of irregularities that had been systematically covered up. The names tied to the company were familiar to Richard, businessmen he had previously seen in luxury galas and exclusive financial meetings. It wasn't just negligence, it was a calculated act of corruption. To save costs on toxic waste disposal, they had poisoned the city's most vulnerable. The most chilling detail came when Eli confessed something he had kept secret. He had overheard one of the nighttime workers mention a deal with city officials, a verbal admission of the scheme. The company had knowingly chosen to dump the waste, counting on the children of the shelters, parks, and poor neighborhoods to be the unnoticed victims. No one would care if sick children went unnoticed, but they hadn't counted on Emily. "She wasn't supposed to be there," Eli said. "She was never meant to drink the water." Richard understood immediately. Emily, a wealthy girl visiting a public park, was an anomaly. The silent victims were supposed to be children like Eli, invisible to society. But Emily's case threatened to expose everything. That night, Richard confronted Laura with the full scope of the discovery. Both felt the weight of the horror pressing against them. Their daughter was sick, not from a rare disease, but from the sheer greed of people who saw lives as expendable collateral damage. Laura broke down, her body trembling with rage and helplessness, but Richard was no longer the man who hesitated. His daughter had become the crack that could shatter the entire facade. Richard and Laura made the decision to compile a complete dossier. It contained photographic evidence, testimonies from Eli and the other children, contamination reports, and proof of the illegal contracts linking the construction company to public officials. They would take this not just to the media, but to federal investigators, bypassing the local authorities entirely. Meanwhile, Emily's condition worsened again. She now struggled even to breathe unassisted. The hospital's chief physician admitted without euphemisms that they might be approaching the point of no return. Richard sat beside her, holding her frail hand, while Eli remained silently at the foot of the bed. The boy's presence was now natural, almost as if he were part of the family. The bond between him and Richard was undeniable, built on urgency, but also on something deeper, an unspoken connection that neither fully understood yet. Eli watched Emily carefully, but his gaze was heavy, as if he were carrying the weight of more than just the current tragedy. Richard noticed. "You know more than you're telling me," he said softly. Eli lowered his head, conflicted. "I promised I would help, and I will," he replied, without elaborating. The next day, with everything prepared, Richard scheduled a private meeting with one of the most influential investigative journalists in the country, someone he trusted, would not be intimidated by the names involved. The evidence was delivered under strict confidentiality. However, Richard knew that this would not be enough. The network of influence and fear surrounding the scandal was vast and entrenched. To break it, he would have to make it impossible for them to hide. That evening, Richard arranged for a live interview, breaking his media silence. His name alone guaranteed national attention. Every major news network marked the appearance on their schedules. But it wasn't the markets or corporate rivals who were waiting anxiously this time. It was families, parents of the sick children, and those who, like Richard, had lost faith in the system. When the cameras turned on, Richard faced them without notes, without prepared speeches, and without the cold persona he had always worn in public. His voice trembled slightly at first, but soon steadied. He told the story, from the symptoms. Emily showed through the discovery of the contaminated park, the hidden shelter, and the innocent children poisoned by corruption. Richard ended the interview by displaying a photo of Emily and the other children. "This is not a tragedy of chance," he said. "This is the result of greed, negligence, and criminal decisions made by people who thought no one would care. I care, and I won't stop until justice is done." The broadcast exploded across the country. Social media flooded with outrage. Parents from every neighborhood confirmed similar symptoms in their children, and soon the pattern was undeniable. Hospitals began receiving hundreds of cases overnight. The contamination was far more widespread than Richard or anyone had imagined. In the days that followed, city officials tried to minimize the situation, but the evidence Richard presented left no room for manipulation. Under growing pressure, state and federal agencies were forced to act. Richard knew the hardest part was still ahead. The forces he was now facing would not surrender easily. But looking at Emily, unconscious but still fighting and remembering Eli's resolve, he understood there was no turning back. He had unveiled the hidden clues. The city was no longer able to mask its horror. Overnight, Richard's interview had become the headline of every major news outlet in the country. The images of sick children, the footage of the underground shelter, and the evidence of contamination spread like wildfire. Protesters flooded the streets demanding answers. Parents from every borough came forward, revealing that their children too had shown similar symptoms after visiting the same park. What had started as a localized tragedy now exploded into a public health crisis of enormous proportions. Richard remained at the center of the storm, though he had never felt so isolated. The financial elite with whom he had dined and negotiated for decades turned their backs on him. He received calls from old acquaintances warning him, threatening him, and advising him to stay quiet. Some tried to persuade him with money, offering donations to Emily's treatment or promising to mitigate the crisis if he withdrew the accusations. But Richard was no longer the man who measured life by profits. With Laura at his side, he focused all his energy on pressuring the authorities and guiding the media narrative. Every interview, Every statement now served a single purpose: to force action. But Richard knew that the media alone would not be enough. He needed undeniable legal proof to corner those responsible. That proof came through one of the private investigators he had hired. Late one night, Richard received a video recording taken secretly during one of the park's renovation nights. It showed trucks unloading barrels with hazardous material labels. The workers, wearing no proper safety equipment, emptied the contents into the park's old maintenance system, directly connecting to the children's water sources. More damning than the images themselves were the voices caught on the audio. Two men clearly discussing the urgency of finishing the job before the morning inspection and mentioning the mayor's office and the council's blessing to proceed without leaving traces. The next morning, Richard delivered the footage directly to the federal authorities and made it public simultaneously. The response was immediate. Arrest warrants were issued for several executives and city officials involved. The construction company's headquarters were raided, and a judicial order sealed all areas related to the park's maintenance and supply chain. The city's political and business elite was in turmoil, but amidst the unfolding scandal, Richard's attention remained solely on Emily. Her condition was now critical. The doctors admitted they had never seen a case so advanced. The damage to her internal systems, particularly neurological and respiratory, was rapidly progressing. Laura could barely hold herself together. Richard remained at Emily's side, hour after hour, refusing to leave, holding her hand and whispering promises of recovery she could barely hear. Eli, who stayed close but always discreet, finally approached Richard with a gravity that Richard had not seen before. "There's something you need to know," Eli said quietly, as they stood in the hospital's empty corridor. Richard, exhausted, looked at the boy who, despite everything, remained calm and unwavering. "What is it?" he asked. Eli took a deep breath. "I was there the night they dumped the waste," he confessed. "I saw who gave the orders. It wasn't just corrupt workers. I saw one of your old partners there, a man from your own board." Richard felt a chill run through his entire body. "Who?" he asked, already fearing the answer. Eli hesitated, then spoke the name. "Charles Denton." Richard's heart stopped for a second. Denton was one of the oldest and most influential partners in Evans Corporation, someone Richard had trusted for years. He had been part of the inner circle, attending every gala, every negotiation. Denton had been responsible for overseeing several of the company's infrastructure investments, including the contracting of the firm responsible for the park's renovation. It all made horrifying sense now. The decision to subcontract to that construction company, the approval of emergency funds for the project, the omitted details in the contracts, it all had Denton's fingerprints. Richard had unwittingly facilitated part of the scheme, trusting someone who shared his own office walls. With this new piece of information, Richard knew that exposing the truth was no longer just about taking down an anonymous group of corrupt officials. He would have to confront his own legacy, his own company, and the people he had helped empower. Determined, Richard returned to his office after weeks away. The building, once a symbol of power, now felt like the lair of betrayal. He demanded a board meeting, which was attended by nervous executives and board members desperate to minimize the crisis. Denton, as composed as ever, pretended to be concerned, feigning solidarity while suggesting that the company should cooperate with the authorities. Richard played the footage in the boardroom without a word. The image of Denton, clearly illuminated by the floodlights of the nighttime work, overseeing the disposal of the toxic waste, left no room for defense. The room plunged into silence. Denton's face paled and he stood, trying to justify himself, but Richard did not give him the chance. "You did this," Richard said coldly. "You poisoned children, you killed them, and you almost took my daughter." The meeting ended in chaos. Security escorted Denton out, and within hours, he was arrested, along with others involved. Richard immediately released a public statement, resigning from his position at Evans Corporation and committing all his resources to the investigation and resolution of the crisis. He had built the company, but he would not let it stand on the blood of innocent children. While the media exploded once again with the shocking revelation of Denton's direct involvement, Richard returned to the hospital, knowing that the fight was far from over. He now had the world's attention and undeniable proof, but Emily's life was still hanging by a thread. Eli remained by his side, more reserved than ever. The boy had seen too much to allow himself to hope easily. Richard knew he had won a battle, but the war, the one that mattered most, was still being fought in Emily's small, weakened body. And there, in that sterile room, with the city in revolt outside, Richard faced the only truth that truly mattered. Without Emily, none of it would make sense. The storm outside intensified, as if the city itself reacted to the chaos unraveling in its heart. News of the arrests and the scandalous corruption linked to the contamination dominated the national conversation. Yet inside Emily's hospital room, the world seemed to have stopped. Richard, sitting at her bedside, watched her fragile body connected to machines that did more and more of the work that life itself should be doing. The doctors were clear. Emily was nearing the end. The toxins had caused severe neurological and respiratory damage. The only remaining option was an experimental treatment, an untested detoxification protocol that could either reverse the damage or accelerate her decline. The risks were staggering and the odds of success minimal. Laura, worn down by despair, left the final decision to Richard. He sat by Emily's side, weighing the unimaginable. Yet despite the medical risks, Richard knew that standing still would only mean watching his daughter fade away. The logical, cautious man who always calculated every scenario was gone, replaced by a father who could no longer accept the idea of losing his child without exhausting every possibility. With a heavy heart, he authorized the treatment. Eli remained, in the background, watching silently as Richard signed the consent forms. The boy's quiet presence during these moments became, paradoxically, a source of comfort. His unwavering calm was no longer mysterious. It was the calm of someone who had already seen too much tragedy to fear it anymore. Richard, though, could not help but feel a sense of injustice. Why did a child like Eli have to carry such a burden? Why were these children left to suffer alone, while men like Denton lived in luxury? As the treatment began, the hospital became a tense battleground. The medical team worked tirelessly, adjusting dosages, monitoring Emily's every reaction, and preparing for the worst. Laura and Richard remained by her side, holding on to each other more out of desperation than hope. Hours passed without significant changes, and at every beep of the machines, Richard's heart sank further. Meanwhile, outside the hospital, the scandal grew uncontrollably. Protesters gathered by the thousands. Parents, journalists, and activists marched through the streets demanding justice, not just for the affected children, but for all the neglected lives the city had ignored. Richard's resignation from Evans Corporation, instead of diminishing him, had elevated him in the public eye. He was no longer seen as just another executive. He was the father who had stood against the very system he had helped build. Federal investigations revealed even deeper corruption than initially suspected. Dozens of public contracts were under scrutiny. The media uncovered links between Denton and several high-ranking officials who had profited from similar illegal waste dumping operations. The scandal now reached national proportions, threatening to collapse the city's political structure. Yet none of that mattered to Richard. His entire focus remained on the small hospital room, where Emily remained between life and death. Each hour felt like an eternity, each silence from the doctors a sharp dagger. On the third night after the treatment began, Emily's heart stopped. The alarms triggered chaos. Doctors and nurses flooded the room, initiating resuscitation protocols. Laura collapsed into sobs, while Richard, paralyzed, could only watch as his world unraveled. Time seemed to suspend itself as they worked desperately to bring Emily back. Seconds felt like years, and all Richard could do was whisper her name, begging her not to leave. Eli stood outside the room, watching silently. He didn't move, didn't cry, but clenched his fists so tightly that his knuckles turned white. After what seemed like an eternity, a weak but steady beep filled the room. Emily's heart was beating again. The doctors stabilized her, but warned that the situation remained critical. Nevertheless, Richard, exhausted and emotionally drained, felt a sliver of hope break through the darkness for the first time in days. Eli disappeared from the hospital that night, leaving Richard worried. It was unlike the boy to vanish without warning. The next day, Laura, noticing Richard's concern, suggested that perhaps Eli had gone to help the other children. Despite everything, Richard couldn't shake the unease. Eli was more than just a child caught up in the tragedy. There was something about him, something that hinted at a deeper connection, a truth that Richard still hadn't uncovered. With Emily stabilized but still unconscious, Richard focused on what remained of his strength to keep the pressure on the authorities. He made sure the media attention wouldn't fade. More families came forward, more protests erupted, and the list of affected children grew daily. The scandal now threatened to paralyze the city government entirely. Behind closed doors, political figures and businessmen scrambled to contain the damage. Some attempted to negotiate with Richard, offering immunity, financial settlements, or the quiet promise of special medical resources for Emily. Richard rejected every offer. He knew these were the same people who had turned a blind eye while children suffered. There would be no deals. And then came the final blow. Eli returned late one night, carrying with him a small, worn notebook. Inside were pages filled with dates, descriptions, and even sketches. It was Samuel's notebook. Richard recognized his brother's handwriting instantly. The notes detailed in a child's fragmented manner what appeared to be his experiences before he disappeared years ago. Through trembling pages, Richard realized that Samuel had discovered a similar scheme decades earlier. The Evans family's old company, before it became Evans Corporation, had been involved in another environmental crime resulting in several deaths among poorer communities. His parents, unwilling to let the family name be tainted, had hidden everything. Samuel had found out and tried to expose it, only to vanish without explanation. Tears filled Richard's eyes as the realization crushed him. Eli wasn't just a child helping out of compassion. He was somehow connected to Samuel, whether by blood or by the legacy of a child who had refused to stay silent. Eli closed the notebook carefully. "I told you, sir," he said. "This has happened before. But this time you're listening." Richard held the notebook tightly, understanding the weight of what he held. This wasn't just about the park or about the corruption of today. It was about a pattern, one that had been repeating, hidden behind layers of power, for years. He realized then that this wasn't just the final risk to save Emily. It was a final chance to break the cycle. The revelation of Samuel's notebook changed everything. Richard spent the entire night reading and rereading each page, each scribbled note, each fragmented memory. The child's handwriting documented not only what Samuel had discovered, but also the anguish he felt, the sense of helplessness, and the horror of realizing that their own parents were involved in a crime that cost innocent lives. The most painful part was the clear intention Samuel had to expose the truth. He had disappeared not due to a random accident, but because he tried to act against powerful interests. With the notebook in hand, Richard now possessed the final, missing piece. It was more than just evidence. It was a record of a pattern, a cycle of crimes repeated over decades by those who profited from the suffering of the invisible. The same corrupt system that had silenced Samuel now threatened to claim Emily and countless others. Richard presented the notebook directly to the federal agents leading the case. The content was shocking, confirming that the recent tragedy wasn't an isolated event, but part of a history of systematic cover-ups. The investigators quickly connected the dots. Old names reappeared, some of them still active in the city's political and business spheres. The revelations made national news. The outrage escalated to an unstoppable level. Massive protests broke out not only in New York but across the country. Advocacy groups, parents, and ordinary citizens demanded justice. The once impregnable walls of silence crumbled under the weight of public fury. In the following weeks, several key figures were arrested, including high-ranking government officials, corporate executives, and former board members of Evans Corporation, who had direct or indirect ties to the crimes of the past and present. Richard, however, refused to celebrate. Emily remained in the hospital, her life still hanging by a thread. The experimental treatment had stabilized her, but recovery was uncertain. Every time Richard held her hand, he prayed in silence for another miracle, just as Eli had given them the first one by exposing the truth. In a symbolic gesture, Richard publicly renounced all ties to Evans Corporation. The company, now synonymous with corruption, collapsed under the weight of the scandal. Richard diverted part of his personal fortune into a newly created foundation dedicated to children affected by environmental crimes, focusing on those who, like Eli and the other homeless children, had lived too long in the shadows. The foundation immediately began working to relocate the children from the underground shelter, offering medical care, housing, education, and psychological support. For the first time, these children, invisible for so long, were being seen, treated with dignity and care. Laura played a key role in organizing support networks, using her influence among families and community groups. Eli, however, remained distant. He watched everything unfold without participating in the celebrations or the gratitude that the families expressed. Richard noticed the boy often disappeared, as if burdened by a weight invisible to everyone else. One afternoon, when Richard found him alone on the hospital's rooftop, staring out at the city, he finally asked, "Why do you always walk away when people thank you?" Eli took a while to respond. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the skyline seemed indifferent to the turmoil below. "Because I wasn't supposed to be the one to finish this," he said quietly. Samuel tried, but no one listened. Richard's throat tightened. He realized that Eli wasn't just carrying the trauma of the street, but also the legacy of his brother, of all the forgotten children who had been silenced before. "You did more than anyone," Richard said. "You saved my daughter. You saved dozens." Eli remained silent, but Richard could see in the boy's eyes the flicker of a deeply guarded emotion, perhaps relief, perhaps sadness. A few days later, Emily woke up, weak and disoriented but alive. The hospital erupted in cautious celebration. Laura sobbed uncontrollably, and Richard could barely speak, overwhelmed by emotion. Emily's first word was her father's name, spoken softly but clearly. The media followed every step of her recovery, but Richard kept the cameras away as much as possible. He wanted Emily to recover as a child, not as a symbol of a national scandal. Slowly, she regained strength, responding positively to the ongoing treatment. The nightmare, though far from over, had a glimmer of hope. Meanwhile, the foundation expanded rapidly. Donations poured in from all over the country. People were moved not just by the tragedy, but by Richard's commitment to confronting his own past. Dozens of children were rescued from similar conditions, some even from other cities that, inspired by the exposure of the New York scandal, began to investigate their own infrastructures. Eli, however, remained unchanged. He refused luxury, refused offers of adoption, and avoided the spotlight. He stayed close to Richard and Laura, but maintained a silent distance. He was more than just a boy who helped expose the truth. He was, in many ways, the key that had unlocked decades of lies. Richard understood. Eli wasn't looking for recognition. He wanted to ensure that the story, Samuel's story, was never buried again. And Richard silently promised him that it wouldn't be. Before the end of that turbulent month, the city's government underwent a profound transformation. New elections were called, laws were reviewed, and for the first time in years, public services redirected funds to the neighborhoods most affected by the neglect. The park was permanently closed, and the contaminated areas sealed and subjected to decontamination procedures under federal supervision. For Richard, the fight was far from over, but for the first time he no longer fought alone. Families, journalists, community leaders, and even strangers had joined the cause. Emily, though still in recovery, smiled again, and with each smile, Richard was reminded that some victories aren't just about defeating enemies, but about honoring the lives of those who refuse to be silenced. Eli, sitting at the edge of the hospital garden, watched the children play as if he were the guardian of that hard-earned hope, and Richard knew deep in his heart that without Eli, none of it would have been possible. Spring arrived quietly, bringing a softness to New York that seemed almost incompatible with the turmoil that had recently overtaken the city. The protests subsided, the investigations continued, and the media frenzy gradually faded. Yet, for Richard, Laura, and especially Emily, the consequences of those months remained palpable. Recovery was slow, but it brought small victories each day, an extra step without assistance, a brighter smile, a moment of laughter that no longer sounded forced. The foundation, named Samuel's Light in honor of Richard's younger brother, became a beacon of hope throughout the city. It expanded beyond the abandoned shelters and underground tunnels, reaching children from other neglected areas. With the support of volunteers, doctors, and social workers, Samuel's Light was quickly recognized as one of the most impactful humanitarian initiatives in the country. Yet, amidst the achievements, Richard's greatest concern remained Eli. The boy continued to avoid involvement beyond what was strictly necessary. He attended Emily's recovery sessions, always discreet, and helped some of the other children adapt to their new reality, but he never fully integrated. He remained a shadow at the edge of every event, as if afraid of crossing a line he could no longer return from. Richard respected his space, though he longed to bring Eli closer, not out of obligation, but because he now saw him as part of their family. One warm afternoon after one of Emily's therapy sessions, Richard found Eli alone in the hospital garden. The boy watched from a distance as Emily, still fragile but smiling, tried to play with other children. Richard approached without saying anything at first. They stood together in silence, watching Emily move with determination despite the weakness in her legs. "She's strong," Eli finally said. "She is," Richard agreed, glancing at the boy. "Like you." Eli lowered his head, visibly uncomfortable. "She'll be fine now. You don't need me anymore." Richard took a deep breath. He had expected this. Eli had always behaved like someone who saw his role as temporary. "You were never just here for her, Eli. You've carried this burden alone for too long. Samuel, he tried to stop this once, but you finished it." Eli's eyes watered, but he refused to let the tears fall. "It's not over. There are more children, more places like that park, more people like Denton." Richard knelt beside him, trying to meet his gaze. "Then help me. Stay. Be part of Samuel's Light. Not because you owe me or Emily anything, but because no one else could do what you did. No one else saw what you saw." For a long moment, Eli remained silent. When he finally looked up, Richard saw not the lost child who had first approached him on that winter morning, but someone who had decided on his own terms to fight. "I'll stay," Eli said, "but not for you, for them." Richard nodded, knowing there was no better reason. Days later, Emily, stronger now, officially met Eli for the first time outside the shadows of hospital corridors. Laura organized a small gathering with the families of the rescued children. Emily, curious and brave as always, approached Eli without hesitation. "Are you the angel without wings Daddy told me about?" she asked with innocent sincerity. Eli blushed, clearly embarrassed. "I'm just Eli." "But you saved me," Emily insisted. Eli tried to deny it, but Emily, with the stubbornness of those who know the truth without understanding all its weight, hugged him tightly. In that small gesture, something inside Eli shifted. For the first time, he allowed himself to simply be a child, if only for a moment. The scene marked the beginning of a new chapter. Eli gradually integrated into Samuel's Light, not as a mascot or symbol, but as an essential part of the team. His knowledge of the streets, his resilience, and his empathy turned him into a leader among the rescued children. He knew where to look, how to listen, and most importantly, how to be there for those who had no one else. Richard, in turn, embraced his new role as a father, not only to Emily, but also to dozens of children who, like Eli, had been left behind. Laura became one of the Foundation's most active voices, using her knowledge and connections to ensure the cause was never forgotten. Months passed, and Emily recovered far beyond the doctor's expectations. She returned to school, resumed her favorite activities, and often visited Samuel's Light, where she loved to play and read stories to the other children. Yet, she never forgot that, in the middle of the chaos, it was Eli who gave her the chance to live. On the anniversary of the Foundation's inauguration, a large ceremony was held in the city. Not a celebration of Richard's wealth or power, but of resistance, of the children who had survived, and of those who, like Samuel, had not. Eli was invited to speak but refused, choosing instead to stay among the children, smiling discreetly while watching the speeches. Before the event ended, Emily, with childlike boldness, pulled Eli onto the stage. "He is the real hero," she declared, pointing to him. The crowd applauded, but Eli, without theatrics, simply waved and whispered to Richard, "Tell them it's not about heroes, it's about never looking away again." And Richard understood. The story that began with a beggar's warning was never just about saving a single child. It was about opening eyes that had remained closed for too long. In that final gesture, surrounded by children who were no longer invisible, by parents who now fought fiercely for their rights, and by a city forced to change, Richard Evans found something he had lost long before the towers of Evans Corporation were ever built: